September 26, 1983, began like any other night inside Serpukhov 15, the secret Soviet early warning command center buried deep in the forests outside Moscow, a place so classified that even senior military officers didn't know it existed, a place whose only purpose was to watch the skies for the first flash of American nuclear missiles, a place where a single signal could trigger the end of the world. But on that night, as Cold War tensions reached their most dangerous point since the Cuban Missile Crisis, the entire Soviet Union came within seconds of launching a retaliatory nuclear strike based not on enemy action, but on a computer glitch that fooled one of the most advanced warning systems of its time. The year leading up to that night had been a disaster for U.S.-Soviet relations. Ronald Reagan had declared the USSR the evil empire. NATO had begun preparing to deploy Pershing II missiles in Europe, weapons that could hit Moscow in under 10 minutes. The Strategic Defense Initiative, Star Wars, had convinced the Kremlin the U.S. was preparing for a first strike, and the Soviets themselves had just shot down Korean Airlines Flight 007, killing 269 civilians and making the entire world see them as unstable, reckless, and paranoid. Inside the Kremlin, Yuri Andropov, the former KGB chief now serving as general secretary, was convinced the CIA was planning to exploit the chaos by launching a surprise nuclear attack disguised as a military exercise. The KGB's global intelligence program, Operation Ryan, was explicitly ordered to watch for signs that the U.S. was preparing to deliver a sudden nuclear missile strike, and intelligence officers around the world were feverishly cataloging every unusual movement in NATO countries, from the number of lights on in Pentagon offices at night to the frequency of blood drives in West Germany. The Soviet Union was on hair-trigger alert, convinced that Armageddon would begin not through diplomacy or escalation, but through 10 minutes of silence, followed by absolute annihilation. And it was into this world of tension, exhaustion, and fear that Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Petrov walked as he reported for duty that night, unaware that the entire fate of the planet was about to fall into his hands, not through heroism, not through training, but through a malfunction in a system designed to prevent exactly this scenario. Serpukhov 15 was the nerve center of the Oko early warning satellite network, a constellation of orbital detectors designed to spot the infrared plume of American ICBMs rising from silos in North Dakota, Montana, and Wyoming. Unlike ground-based radar, which could only detect incoming missiles once they crested the horizon, Oko could see a launch almost immediately, giving the Soviet leadership precious minutes to decide whether to launch their own missiles before they were destroyed. The entire system relied on speed, automation, and rigid protocol. If Oko detected a launch, an alarm would sound. Petrov would verify the detection. High command would be alerted. The Politburo would be called from bed, and the Soviet nuclear arsenal would begin warming up for a retaliatory strike. There was no room for hesitation, no room for doubt, no room for human error. And yet, within just minutes of Petrov beginning his shift, the screen in front of him suddenly turned blood red as a single unbelievable word flashed in enormous glowing letters: launch. The system was reporting that the United States had fired an intercontinental ballistic missile directly at the Soviet Union. The officers inside the bunker froze. The siren began blaring. Lights flashed on the walls. Decades of training drilled into them that this was it, the scenario they had feared, the moment where the fate of the Soviet Union and the planet was decided in seconds. Petrov stared at the screen, his mind racing, his heart pounding so hard he could feel it in his throat. The protocols were clear. He was required to pick up the phone, call his superiors, and report a confirmed U.S. launch. Once he made that call, the process of retaliation would begin automatically, and the Soviet nuclear forces would move toward launch readiness. But something felt wrong. One missile? The Americans would never start a nuclear war with a single missile. Their entire strategic doctrine was built on overwhelming first strike capacity, hundreds of warheads launched simultaneously to blind and crush the Soviet command. A single missile made no sense. Before Petrov could finish processing the thought, the alarm sounded again. A second missile, then a third, then a fourth, then a fifth. Now the Oko system was reporting not a glitch, not an anomaly, but a coordinated American nuclear strike, exactly the kind the Soviets had feared throughout the entire year. 5 missiles, rising from the heart of the United States and streaking across the atmosphere toward Soviet territory. The room erupted into controlled panic. Officers leapt from their stations. Commands were shouted across the bunker. Warning lights flashed across the main board. The countdown clock began ticking, measuring how long the Soviet leadership would have to authorize a retaliatory launch before the American missiles arrived. Yet something still didn't make sense to Petrov. 5 missiles were not enough. If the Americans truly intended to cripple the Soviet Union's ability to retaliate, they would have to launch everything, not 5 missiles, 500. The logic of nuclear war demanded total destruction, not symbolic attack. And so Petrov hesitated, not because he was a hero, not because he wanted to defy orders, but because the data didn't add up. Everything he had learned in training, everything he knew about American nuclear doctrine, everything the Kremlin itself believed, none of it supported the idea that the U.S. would launch such a small strike. Yet the computer insisted. The satellites insisted. The system insisted. This was a real attack. Petrov had only a few minutes to decide whether to report this as an actual launch, a decision that would trigger a chain reaction leading to the firing of thousands of nuclear warheads, the destruction of NATO, the annihilation of the Warsaw Pact, and the deaths of hundreds of millions of people. If he dismissed the alert, and it was real, the Soviet Union would be vaporized. If he reported it, and it was false, he would have unleashed the end of the world. Inside the bunker, officers were begging him to make the call. The entire room had gone dead silent except for the sirens. The countdown clock continued to fall. Sweat dripped down Petrov's face. His hand hovered over the phone. His brain raced through every possibility. And then, in a decision that defied protocol, defied training, and defied the rigid authoritarian structure of the Soviet military, Petrov declared the alarm a false launch. He told his superiors it was a system malfunction. He told the officers in the room to stand down. He told the computer it was wrong. Then he waited to see if Moscow would explode. For the next several agonizing minutes, Stanislav Petrov sat in his chair at Serpukhov 15, waiting to see whether he had just doomed his country or saved the world. Because if the alert was real, then American nuclear warheads were already cutting through the upper atmosphere on a trajectory toward Soviet command bunkers, missile silos, and major cities, and the first impacts would occur before he could even reach the surface. Yet, as the seconds passed and no detonations came, the bunker remained consumed by a suffocating mixture of fear, silence, and disbelief. The officers around him, watching the screens with white-knuckled terror, uncertain whether they were witnessing a malfunction or the final moments of their lives, And this tension was amplified by the knowledge that the Soviet early warning system had never produced a false alarm of this magnitude before, meaning Petrov was gambling not only with protocol, but with the survival of his nation. The Oko satellite network should have been reliable. After all, Moscow had invested billions of rubles into building a system capable of detecting the infrared signature of U.S. missile launches, and its designers were certain it could distinguish between real ICBMs and environmental noise. But in reality, Oko was still new, still unproven, and operated in a geopolitical environment so paranoid that even a minor anomaly could trigger disaster. Worse still, the Soviet leadership had no faith in the Americans' intentions, interpreting every NATO exercise, every satellite movement, and every political speech as evidence the U.S. was preparing for a decapitation strike. Petrov knew all of this. He knew that the Kremlin had been expecting a surprise attack for months. He knew that Andropov's health problems and isolation had made him more suspicious and more reactive. And he knew that if he followed the rules, the Politburo would authorize immediate retaliation long before radar confirmed the launch, because radar detection came too late in the nuclear timeline to guarantee a second strike capability. As the minutes dragged on, Petrov experienced something almost impossible to describe. The sensation of waiting for an apocalypse that might not arrive. The sickening feeling of watching a clock tick down toward annihilation while praying it was all a technological mirage. And as the tension peaked, the bunker suddenly erupted with a fresh wave of alarms. Not missile launches this time, but the arrival of the final verification stage. Ground-based radar systems across the Soviet Union were now activated, sweeping the skies for any sign of approaching warheads, and the officers in the bunker braced themselves for confirmation, knowing that radar detection would eliminate all doubt. If the missiles were real, they would appear on radar within moments. If not, Petrov would be vindicated. But the Soviet command structure did not tolerate deviation, and he knew that even if he were correct, he would still face punishment for ignoring protocol, because the system valued obedience above logic. Seconds passed, then more. Sweat poured down Petrov's back. Officers whispered prayers, curses, and frantic pleas under their breath. Senior commanders hovered behind the consoles, terrified of what the screens might reveal. And then, at last, radar reported nothing. No blips, no incoming warheads, no American attack. The U.S. missile fields were silent. The sky above the Soviet Union remained empty. The warning had been false. The world had come within minutes of total destruction. Not because of aggression, but because of a flaw in an early warning satellite's interpretation of sunlight reflected off high-altitude clouds above the American Midwest. The Oko system had mistaken sun glint, light bouncing off the tops of clouds at the exact angle to mimic the infrared signatures of missile launches for nuclear war. A coincidence of orbital geometry had triggered the near end of humanity. But while the immediate danger had passed, Petrov's nightmare was only beginning, because he now had to report that he had ignored the computer, violated protocol, and withheld the alarm from high command, actions that could easily be interpreted as treason. Officers around him, though relieved, looked at him with a mixture of awe and disbelief, unable to process how he had kept his composure long enough to prevent a retaliatory launch. The Soviet military did not admire initiative. It admired compliance. And Petrov knew that when he left the bunker at sunrise, he might be arrested, interrogated, or quietly reassigned to oblivion. When his superiors arrived for the debrief, they were furious, not because the alarm was false, but because Petrov had deviated from the strict chain of command. He tried to explain his reasoning, pointing out that 5 missiles made no strategic sense as a first strike, that the system's reliability was still unproven, and that there was no corroboration from radar or additional satellites. But the colonels and generals were uninterested in logic, instead ordering him to complete pages of reports documenting every aspect of the event. Petrov later described this as the most stressful part of the entire night, not the near apocalypse, but the fear of what the Soviet state might do to him for exercising judgment at the wrong moment. The officers interrogating him noted that he had saved the country, but criticized him for not following protocol, a paradox that defined his entire life. In the days that followed, Petrov's superiors were divided. Some saw him as having prevented an irreversible catastrophe. Others believed he had dangerously undermined the command structure. Ultimately, because the Oko system's flaws needed to remain secret, his role in averting nuclear war was buried. He was neither rewarded nor imprisoned. He was simply reassigned to a less sensitive department, his career quietly sidelined, even as his decision became one of the most consequential of the entire Cold War. Months later, when NATO conducted Able Archer 83, a realistic military exercise that the Soviets misinterpreted as possible cover for a nuclear first strike, the memory of the September false alarm haunted Soviet intelligence. The Kremlin's fear of misreading American intentions spiked. Analysts worried that the next alarm might be real, and Petrov, now removed from early warning duties, watched from the sidelines as the world drifted toward yet another nuclear confrontation, knowing more than anyone how fragile the line was between peace and annihilation. His decision had prevented disaster once, but he had no faith the system would survive the next mistake. And the truth was chilling. On September 26, 1983, the world did not narrowly avoid nuclear war because of technology, strategy, or policy. It survived because one exhausted officer trusted his instincts more than a machine. In the aftermath of the September 26th false alarm, as the Soviet Union quietly investigated the cause of the malfunction and weighed the terrifying implications of how close they had come to initiating nuclear Armageddon, a growing awareness spread among the upper echelons of the Soviet military. Their early warning system, the technological shield meant to guarantee the survival of the motherland, was fundamentally flawed, built on shaky assumptions, rushed engineering, and political pressure rather than scientific rigor. And this realization sent shockwaves through the command structure because it undermined the core of Soviet nuclear strategy: launch on warning. For decades, the Soviets had feared that the United States, with its more advanced technology and larger arsenal, could execute a decapitation strike that would cripple Soviet command centers before they could order retaliation. And so, Moscow had invested enormous resources into building systems that could detect American launches within seconds, giving the Politburo enough time to respond. But the false alarm demonstrated that their eyes in the sky could be fooled by something as trivial and unpredictable as sunlight reflecting off clouds at a certain angle. And worse, the system had interpreted that reflection as a coordinated U.S. strike of 5 missiles, the exact type of limited attack Andropov believed Reagan might use to test Soviet reactions. Inside the Kremlin, panic simmered beneath the surface. If Oko was unreliable, the entire nuclear posture of the USSR was compromised, and the leadership recognized that the next malfunction might not be caught by someone as cautious as Petrov. There were hundreds of officers trained to follow procedure without question, men conditioned to treat computer warnings as absolute truth. and if any one of them had been on duty instead of Petrov, the Soviet Union might have launched its entire arsenal in a catastrophic misunderstanding. Worse still, the Kremlin had no intention of acknowledging the error, publicly or privately. Just weeks earlier, they had shot down Cal 007, and the world saw them as reckless warmongers. Admitting that their early warning network nearly triggered nuclear war would have been political suicide. And within the labyrinth of the Soviet bureaucracy, secrecy took precedence over safety. The scientists and engineers responsible for the Oko system were terrified of reporting its flaws to their superiors. Failure in the Soviet Union was not tolerated, it was punished. Promotions, funding, careers, even lives could be ruined if high-ranking officials decided the malfunction was the result of negligence rather than design limitations. As a result, the internal investigation became a quiet, almost clandestine process, and its findings were buried deep within classified archives. Petrov, meanwhile, found himself reduced to a ghost within the organization, a man whose actions had saved humanity, but whose role could not be celebrated, whose judgment could not be endorsed, and whose instincts could not be mentioned in official doctrine, because acknowledging that a single officer had prevented nuclear war exposed the horrifying fragility of the Soviet command system. In truth, Petrov had committed an unforgivable ideological sin. He had placed human reasoning above the authority of the state and its machines. And so, he was quietly sidelined, stripped of real responsibility, and left to watch as the world edged toward yet another crisis, the NATO military exercise known as Able Archer 83. Able Archer was designed to simulate the transition from conventional conflict to nuclear war, and it included realistic communications protocols, encrypted messages, and the actual movement of NATO command personnel. To Western planners, the exercise was routine, a test of readiness in case of escalation. But, to the Soviets, still shaken by the false alarm and increasingly convinced that Reagan intended to launch a surprise attack, the exercise looked terrifyingly real. Throughout 1983, the KGB had been warning the Kremlin that the United States was searching for the moment of maximum weakness to strike. The deployment of Pershing the Scud missiles had shortened warning times to minutes. Reagan's aggressive rhetoric had convinced Andropov that deterrence was failing. And now, NATO was rehearsing nuclear war with unprecedented realism. Soviet intelligence units began to report indicators that nuclear attack preparations might be underway. The Politburo, influenced by the paranoia of Operation Ryan, ordered the military to elevate readiness levels. Nuclear-capable aircraft were dispersed to forward bases. Strategic missile forces were placed on alert. And inside Serpukhov 15, officers remembered the September false alarm not as a cautionary tale, but as a haunting reminder that the Americans might strike first. In other words, the false alarm primed the Soviet psyche for the next crisis. It created the emotional and psychological conditions under which Able Archer could be misinterpreted as the opening phase of World War III. If the September incident had escalated differently, if Petrov had followed protocol, if the Politburo had been awakened, if missile forces had been placed on high alert, the Soviets might have approached Able Archer with even greater paranoia. The world might have been destroyed in November instead of September. And it was this realization, examined only years later when the archives began to open, that stunned historians. The planet did not survive the fall of 1983 because the Cold War stabilized, but because it was saved twice by pure accident, once by Petrov's intuition, and again by the fact that the Soviet leadership hesitated long enough during Able Archer to to avoid misreading NATO's actions as an imminent attack. By the end of 1983, the Soviet Union was exhausted by fear, distrust, and the crushing weight of maintaining nuclear parity with the United States. Andropov's health deteriorated. The Politburo was paralyzed by indecision. Generals whispered their concerns in private, terrified that the system they had built was too brittle to handle the pressures of nuclear deterrence. And through it all, the memory of that night at Serpukhov 15 lingered like a ghost, an unspoken reminder that a single malfunction, a single human decision, a single misinterpretation of sunlight could have erased civilization. Yet none of this was known to the outside world. In the West, the false alarm remained a secret until after the fall of the Soviet Union. Historians, journalists, and intelligence analysts were left to speculate about how close the world had come to nuclear annihilation during Reagan's first term, unaware that the real answer was not close, but seconds away. Petrov returned home each night carrying a weight no one else could understand. His wife, who knew nothing about his role, grew increasingly concerned about his stress. His colleagues avoided discussing the incident, fearing the walls might have ears. In a nation built on secrecy and suspicion, Petrov became a man who had done something extraordinary but could never speak of it. And outside the bunker of Serpukhov 15, the world continued to spin, oblivious to how fragile peace truly was. The false alarm of September 26th wasn't just a technical malfunction. It was a revelation, a demonstration that nuclear stability depended not on military doctrine or political leadership or advanced technology, but on the flawed, unpredictable judgment of ordinary people thrust into extraordinary situations, people who were given seconds to decide whether the world lived or died. And as the Cold War marched toward its final decade, the memory of that night would shape the fears, strategies, and decisions of those who finally brought the arms race to an end. In the months that followed the September 26th incident, as Petrov faded into bureaucratic obscurity and the Soviet Union continued stumbling through one of the most volatile periods in its existence, the deeper implications of what had nearly happened began to surface within a handful of Soviet research groups tasked with analyzing the reliability of Oko and the future of the USSR's nuclear posture. And what they discovered, and quietly hid, was that the entire early warning architecture was inherently unstable, built in a rush to keep up with American technology, and dangerously vulnerable to the exact type of false signal that had almost triggered the end of the world. The classification of the incident meant only a tiny circle within the Ministry of Defense understood how catastrophic the malfunction had been. To everyone else, the system was still presented as a flawless shield guarding the motherland from American aggression. But behind locked doors, Soviet engineers admitted that the Oko satellites were limited by their orbital geometry, the timing of their passes over the United States, and the sun angle conditions that could create ghost launches, false infrared readings, identical to the plume of an ICBM rising from a silo. The Americans had no idea the Soviets were relying on such fragile technology, and if they had known, they might have realized how easily a misunderstanding could trigger nuclear retaliation. Instead, both superpowers continued their buildup, each believing the other was preparing for a decapitating first strike, each convinced the other might exploit even the smallest advantage. And while the September false alarm remained hidden, the paranoia it intensified played directly into the next major crisis, the approach of Able Archer. 83. By November, NATO forces were engaged in a highly realistic communications drill, transmitting encrypted messages, simulating nuclear release authorization procedures, and relocating key command personnel. To Western planners, it was ordinary training. To the Soviets, already rattled by the false alarm, already obsessed with signs of American deception, it looked like the opening phase of a surprise attack disguised as an exercise. Soviet intelligence analysts pored over every intercepted message, every aircraft movement, every shift in NATO readiness posture. They saw patterns where none existed and coincidences they interpreted as confirmation of their worst fears. The tension was so severe that Soviet missile forces were quietly elevated to higher alert. Nuclear-capable bomber regiments were dispersed to remote airfields, and Warsaw Pact command bunkers were quietly reinforced with emergency personnel. At the same time, senior KGB officials sent frantic cables warning of a possible U.S. first strike imminent within days. Even the smallest behaviors, lights burning late at the Pentagon, increased communications traffic, unusual diplomatic silence, were treated as signs that the Americans were preparing to strike. The key vulnerability was that the Soviets were filtering all their intelligence through the psychological shock of the September false alarm. They had just watched their most advanced warning system falsely report an attack that could have triggered retaliation. Now they believed the Americans might be preparing to attack under cover of an exercise. The connection between the two events wasn't obvious at the time, but it became clear in hindsight. The false alarm had conditioned the Soviet command to assume the worst. It normalized the idea that a nuclear attack could begin with only a few missiles or with only a few signals. It primed them to treat ambiguity as a threat. And in nuclear strategy, ambiguity is the deadliest variable. Intelligence historians would later conclude that the world was even closer to nuclear war during Able Archer than during the September false alarm, because while Petrov had stopped the first crisis through intuition, the second crisis depended on the Soviet leadership not panicking in a moment when panic would have been rational. Andropov was ill, deteriorating rapidly, paranoid, and isolated in a hospital. The Politburo was fractured and indecisive. The KGB was feeding leadership assessments shaped by fear, not logic. And the military was on edge after a near launch caused by a satellite glitch. It was, in hindsight, the worst possible alignment of circumstances, the exact type of environment in which nuclear war could begin not through aggression, but through compounded anxiety. Yet somehow the crisis passed. NATO concluded its exercise. The Soviets, though still suspicious, did not launch. But the fear lingered within military minds on both sides, and as the two superpowers entered the final stretch of the Cold War, the near misses of 1983 reshaped how both thought about nuclear stability. In the United States, intelligence reports began to reveal fragments of the Soviet reaction to Able Archer, and analysts were stunned to learn how close the USSR had come to assuming the exercise was a cover for attack. This revelation helped push the Reagan administration toward a more conciliatory approach in the later 1980s, culminating in arms reduction treaties and a strategic shift away from brinkmanship. Meanwhile, inside the Soviet Union, the memory of the false alarm remained a tightly controlled secret, mentioned only in classified circles, studied only by those who needed to know how close they had come to disaster. Engineers quietly proposed improvements to the Oko system, including redesigned algorithms to filter sun reflections and adjustments to satellite orbits to reduce false positives. But these proposals were slow to implement, often blocked by bureaucratic inertia or political pressure. The Soviet Union itself was weakening, economically, technologically, ideologically, and its ability to maintain a stable, reliable nuclear command system was degrading each year. By the mid-1980s, the Politburo finally authorized upgrades to the early warning network, but the fixes came too late to fully stabilize the system before the USSR collapsed. Throughout this period, Petrov remained silent, bound by secrecy, carrying the weight of what he had prevented. His life did not improve. In fact, it grew more difficult. His wife died of cancer soon after the incident, leaving him in deep depression. His government never rewarded him. His superiors quietly resented him. His health deteriorated. His story remained unknown. And yet, despite being forgotten by the state he had saved, the consequences of his decision continued to shape strategic thinking across the world. Nuclear doctrine experts began arguing that no early warning system, no matter how advanced, should ever trigger retaliation without independent verification. The idea of launch-on warning began to be challenged. The belief that machines could be trusted with the fate of humanity began to erode. In the end, the September 26th false alarm was not just a near miss. It was a paradox. The moment that revealed both the catastrophic danger of automated war and the extraordinary necessity of human judgment. And as the world transitioned toward a new era of nuclear policy, Petrov's silent, unrecognized decision became the invisible anchor that steadied the future. In the decades that followed the collapse of the Soviet Union, as historians, intelligence agencies, and nuclear experts finally gained access to long-sealed archives and eyewitness testimony, the full magnitude of the 1983 false alarm began to emerge. Not as a footnote in Cold War history, but as one of the single most dangerous moments human civilization has ever faced. A moment where the fate of the world depended entirely on the intuition of one exhausted lieutenant colonel sitting inside a dark bunker at Serpukhov 15. Surrounded by sirens, alarms, and a computer system insisting that nuclear war had begun. And as researchers pieced together the events of that night, they began to understand that the danger went far beyond the malfunction itself, because the incident occurred at the height of a geopolitical fever, during a year where both the United States and the Soviet Union genuinely believed the other was preparing a surprise attack, and where every signal, no matter how ambiguous, was interpreted through a lens of fear, suspicion, and worst-case assumptions. In Washington, officials would later admit privately that they had underestimated how terrified the Kremlin was of Reagan's rhetoric, strategic programs, and rapid military modernization. While in Moscow, military leaders admitted that they had overestimated America's desire for a first strike, creating a reality where both sides were preparing for a war neither wanted and were willing to react to shadows as though they were missiles. The 1983 false alarm exposed the lethal fragility of a world built on mutual fear, demonstrating that nuclear deterrence, often portrayed as a stable balance of power, was in reality a delicate, brittle architecture where the smallest malfunction could cause cascading escalation. When the story of the false alarm was finally made public in the 1990s, long after the Soviet Union vanished from the map, the global reaction was immediate and visceral. Disbelief, horror, and a sobering realization that the world had survived the Cold War not through brilliant strategy or flawless technology, but through sheer luck and the instincts of individuals like Petrov. Individuals who had to override systems specifically designed to remove human judgment from the most consequential decisions imaginable. Nuclear policy experts began re-evaluating the very foundation of deterrence, questioning whether any system, American, Russian, or otherwise, could ever be trusted to accurately interpret complex environmental data in real time, especially when the consequences of error were measured not in casualties, but in the annihilation of nations. Western analysts who had long believed that the Soviet Union possessed a hardened, rational, tightly structured command system were stunned to discover that its early warning architecture had been so primitive, so rushed, and so deeply flawed that sunlight bouncing off clouds had almost triggered global destruction. Members of the U.S. intelligence community, after reviewing the incident, quietly revised their assessments of Soviet stability during the early 1980s, concluding that the USSR had been far closer to launching a preemptive strike than anyone in Washington had realized, not because of aggression, but because of desperation, paranoia, and institutional decay. This shift in understanding changed how future policymakers approached nuclear communication protocols, crisis management channels, and verification procedures, leading to the creation of more reliable hotlines, expanded diplomatic back channels, and renewed efforts to reduce the likelihood of miscalculation. Meanwhile, in Russia, Petrov's role remained largely unknown throughout the 1990s, hidden by layers of bureaucratic secrecy and national embarrassment. It was only through the persistence of a handful of researchers and journalists that his story eventually surfaced, revealing to the world that one man had prevented nuclear war simply by refusing to accept the word of a machine. When Petrov was finally recognized, decades too late, he received international honors, awards from peace organizations, and praise from global leaders, all of which he accepted with weary humility. He often stated that he did not feel like a hero, that he had simply been at the right place at the right time, and that anyone else might have done the same. Though, in truth, the history of the Soviet military made it clear that very few would have acted as he did. His life after the incident was quiet, marked by modesty, financial hardship, and the grief of losing his wife, and despite becoming a global symbol of human judgment, triumphing over blind obedience, he never grew comfortable with fame, preferring instead to live out his remaining years in a small apartment outside Moscow. Yet his impact echoed far beyond his personal story, influencing global nuclear doctrine, research on artificial intelligence in warfare, and the growing recognition that automated systems must never be given irreversible authority over weapons of mass destruction. The incident inspired debates within NATO and the Russian Federation about the balance between automation and human oversight, arguments that continued into the 21st century as military powers pursued increasingly autonomous weapon systems. Petrov's legacy became even more relevant as tensions rose in the modern era, with new generations of analysts warning that nuclear postures in the United States, Russia, China, India, Pakistan, and North Korea still relied heavily on early warning systems vulnerable to the same types of errors that nearly destroyed the world in 1983. His story now appears in textbooks, documentaries, and policy briefings as a cautionary tale, a reminder that peace often depends on the courage of individuals who must make impossible decisions under unimaginable pressure. By the time Petrov passed away in 2017, quietly and without fanfare, tributes poured in from across the globe, recognizing him not as a mere officer, but as a guardian of humanity, a man whose skepticism and calm prevented catastrophe, and whose legacy serves as a sobering warning that the mechanisms of nuclear deterrence are far more fragile than nations admit. Looking back, the 1983 false alarm stands as one of the most chilling proofs that humanity's survival is not guaranteed by power, technology, or strategy, but by the fragile hope that the right person will be on duty at the right moment, willing to question the data, the machine, and the doctrine. It is a moment frozen in time. when the world unknowingly hovers on the brink of oblivion, saved not by governments, treaties, or superpowers, but by a single human being who understood that sometimes the greatest act of loyalty is refusing to follow orders.